get in.
Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get this work session moving along, folks. We can take our seats. Thank you. So this is a work session regarding AO 2014 2S, as well as the report from the Citizens Task Force. So let's go ahead and do introductions, starting with Mr. Dunbar.
Forrest Dunbar.
Crystal Kennedy. B. Peterson.
B. Peterson.
Thanks, Alisal.
John Buttleton.
Cameron Perez-Verdillo.
Austin Ford Davidson.
Felix Rivera.
Red Dice.
Christopher Thompson.
And we're also joined by our Assembly Counsel, Dean Gates. So a quick introduction before we get things moving on. So for several months now, and probably for much longer, Mr. Potter and others have reminded us of work that was done in response to the 2012 election, which was fraught with a lot of perils. So Mr. Potter served with a wide range of interested parties on a citizens task force that was formed after that election to review our public process. They came out with a report, which we just got, and in 2014, the Assembly adopted some recommendations, which we also just received. In early 2017, the Assembly decided to roll back some of those recommendations, and they made a whole bunch of other changes to the title. We also received that as well. And I'm told that was done because some of the recommendations didn't work practically. So as we've had multiple discussions on how to make our public process better, I've asked Mr. Potter to speak with us today, and in the future, I'm hopeful that the chair of that task force, the Citizens Task Force, Jane Anvik, will be able to speak with us in the future, because I know this will be a ongoing discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Potter.
I'm not sure if this constitutes the no good deed goes unpunished, but since I opened my mouth and reminded the Assembly that 5 years or so ago there had been a task force committee on a public process as a result of a resolution that went forward that I was upset about, more than happy to try and bring forward the information and kind of the position of why the task force was originally set up. Looking around the room, there's not an Assembly member currently on that is serving all the way through their second stint. Mr. Dyson was around previously and is next go around. So 5 years is a time frame that some of the history's been lost. I think. And if I can go back in context to try and establish, what was happening at the time, back in the early teens of 2010 on, there were continuing problems of multiple S versions of ordinances being created and prepared and thrown on the table. And as we've seen even here recently, or at least I have observed, there are S versions that come up and a member of the public will try and speak intelligently on the item, and then we ask, do they know that there's actually an S1, an S2, an S3? And that was very common back in the day. And it was frustrating because the member of the public would then be faced with a situation where they thought they'd done their homework and came prepared to speak, but they didn't have a copy of the document, S1, 2, or 3, to be able to talk intelligently. So, number one, that made them felt like they'd wasted their time and they weren't prepared. And then they were given the option of, well, if you speak tonight and this is continued, you can't speak on any of the S versions. And that was a significant issue because there were significant changes that were occurring that were more than just minor chromatic changes in the S versions. They were very substantive, and it really wasn't giving the public the ability to be prepared and give their rightful public input to their elected officials. And when AO 37 was kind of the culmination of the ongoing stint of public meetings, continued.
Excuse me, AO 37 was the union labor thing, was
I
not?
believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so not everybody will remember
Right.
that.
And my recollection is it went for about 4 or 4.5 public hearing sessions of the Assembly's hearings. And there were crowds that could not fit in the Assembly chambers. So the foyer was filled. The library hall was filled. People were frustrated because they didn't have access to actually be able to see or watch the meeting, and it was very difficult. And even if they signed up on a list of people to be able to speak, if they weren't sure that they were going to be able to hear when their name was called, and what if they were going to be leaving town and unavailable to speak at some point in the future. So out of that, when the Assembly chair at that time, Ernie Hall, determined that they had had enough public hearing and cut off the public hearing, even though there were still folks that wanted to speak, irregardless of whether their testimony had effectively been given by others or not. The public testimony was interrupted and stopped, and the Assembly went forward. There was a very significant uproar, and there were different opinions on the Assembly and on the administration at that time as to what should happen. Members of the Rules Committee on the Assembly asked that a arm's length task force be put together of people that were either regular testifiers or people who were very familiar with the public hearing process and could reach out to the public, have a series of public meetings, listen to the frustrations and the ideas or thoughts about how the process might be improved, or that it could be set up to ensure that the Assembly can efficiently get their work and the people's work done, but at the same time ensure that your constituents and the public have an opportunity to have fully informed public debate and discussion with their elected officials at a public hearing. So that was the outcome. There was a group of people put together. Jeannie Andick served as the chair. We had multiple public hearings and sat in your seats in the Assembly chamber and took public testimony from the general public and interested parties as to what they felt was broken, what their thoughts were about how it could be fixed, and what the real needs were. We met independently in work sessions as a working group and task force. We met with the Rules Committee and worked through our reports and recommendations, and then came out with a published set of recommendations, many of which were then incorporated and codified by ordinance, so that there really was now an outline of how the process was supposed to work and how things like subversion, substantive changes, and that would be handled. The ability of the public to be able to speak on substantive changes, like with S1 or S2 or S3 versions, or significant amendments, and that there would be a practical and appropriate process for those very controversial issues in larger meetings that would be held, so that the background information was communicated and available to the public, and that they would have an opportunity, and a reasonable, fair opportunity to provide input. So prior to that, there had not really been, for the benefit of the Assembly chair or the Assembly, anything codified that gave direction or policy guidance as to how it was going to occur. And the Assembly felt that that would be appropriate, so that it wasn't a big question mark every time they got into a situation. So it attempted to try and give some direction and guidelines as to how to operate and how to process the public process in a lot of different conditions there were some issues that were probably mostly related to the response to the AO 37 public process that was cut off, that were the ones that in 2017 were scaled back a bit, because it did make some things fairly significant for the clerk's office to try and deal with, making sure that there were lists of names. If someone demanded that there be a list of names for testifiers prior to meetings and that. So I think that Barbara can speak to that as well. But all in all, our real effort was to try and identify and recognize that the Assembly has a responsibility to be able to efficiently process and deal with the public's and the people's business. And there's probably some things on your consent agenda that can be modified as to what goes in there and how much there has to be a reading of each title. That is put in the blue folder and that so that you can move things along a bit and be efficient. But also to ensure that, in fact, when you're taking an action, especially if it is a public hearing action, that there is fair and responsible and reasonable ability for the public to testify, and that they are not being forced to try and outguess what is actually before the Assembly. The public should have an idea and be able to find out so that they can not waste their time and give you competent, thoughtful testimony. With that, I guess I'd be happy to answer any questions or comments.
Sure. Mrs. Alto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Potter. We receive a lot of emails as well, and I feel like for a lot of my constituents, email is a good way to be in contact with us. And I've been encouraging folks at every community council meeting, every meeting, to get in touch with us via email, phone call, in addition to public testimony opportunities. Do you have any thoughts about the use of email in lieu of or in conjunction with public testimony based on your experience with the body?
I think it's another very acceptable way. You have to deal with the volumes. That's part of the job. That's what you signed up for. And whether you like it or not, you're going to get emails, you're going to get letters, you're going to get phone calls, you're going to get voicemails. People are going to stop at the grocery store, on the street corner, whatever. And it is your responsibility to take and accept that input. Email is convenient for a lot of people now with an onset of technology as we have it. And, as long as it's not abused, it's an appropriate way for you to deal with it. And you can submit written testimony, so whether it's via email or a voicemail on the phone or a letter to you or in public at the hearing, that's an appropriate method of collecting input.
Thank you, Mrs. Alto. Yes, Mr. Dicey.
Yeah, I'm really glad we're having this discussion. And I want somebody to help me think through, in our being a constitutional republic, what is the role of public input. And we obviously shouldn't be making our policy decisions based upon the loudest voice or the most people or whatever, and under our system, as I understand it, what we're supposed to do is pick the wise elders of the tribe, to go and do the work and make the decisions and so on and so forth, and we citizens get to pick those for whatever reason. So then our public meetings and work sessions and so on and so forth are not the primary thing to do. There is not to gather more information and so on and so forth, but we need the information. And oftentimes people who are got skin in the game or the exposure will know things that I don't know that I need to have. But that's 5 or 10% of the information I get. The rest of it's very repetitive often, just form letters that get sent out. So, but literally 2 years ago, when I joined the assembly again, my first meeting, I went resolved to shut up and not saying anything. And I saw a piece of legislation changed at the table, and I said, wait a minute, we ought not to vote on this until the stakeholders who are sitting right there have a chance to give us some input. I mean, this is just echoing the very point, you know, and the chair at the time, who I really respect, said, we don't do it we haven't done it that way. And I'm sitting, darn it, it needs to be done that way, you know. And so I just called time out and went and talked to the people who got their input, which was a responsible thing to do. So, and then of course, this is a pejorative comment, a lot of folks just want to be heard, you know, and they've got a dog in the fight or a perceived dog in the fight, and they want to vent or let people know how doggone strong they feel about it. How much public time do we take, you know, for that? But my fundamental question is, what do we as the policymakers owe to the public to give almost open-ended time for them to be heard, you know, when there is all these other ways to do it, telephones, text messages, and emails, you know, and stopping us in cars, you know. So I hope somebody would kind of help me think through that. Yeah, what's a fundamental issue in my perspective.
And Mr. Dyson, I guess in response to that, and, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, and you can ask my wife what she thinks about it, but I think I hold the record and will probably hold it forever as far as people that have sat through assembly meetings.
I know, I pray for you
meetings.
regularly.
And thank you, I need it. That it is your, as the assembly, responsibility to make sure that the process is fair and open, and you should always err on the side of making sure the public has a chance to speak.
Sure.
But you're also responsible for determining whether or not, in your judgment, collectively, if it is a substantive change or not. And really what your responsibility is that if you make that decision as to whether or not it's not substantive or it is, you should do that collectively, make a decision and put your findings on the record as to why you're doing it that way.
Yeah, that's true.
As Mr. Gates or any other attorney in the office will tell you, the easiest and most successful way to challenge an action is on process.
Yeah.
So you also have a responsibility to make sure that your process is defensible and complete.
Yeah. If I may, Mr. Chair, that's why your point about when we change the things before us, we need to be really fair and straight and all possible delay when possible. Yeah, we agree. The other one is just when there's an issue up and there hasn't been any substantive changes, we've got, you know, scores at least, if not hundreds sometimes, of people who want to testify. What do we owe to them under our form of government to have the public voice at that meeting when they have several other ways of communicating with us?
If someone is going to take the time to come to your public hearing on a specific item, it is the basis of our republic, I guess, and our democracy to be able to be heard. And I don't know that it's either appropriate or anything for the assembly members to sit in judgment as to whether or not Bob Smith or Joe Schmuck has more of a right to speak than another, or if that person, you can prod the audience and try and give them direction. It's the chair's job to say, you know, if you, and and the assembly has done this over the years, that, you know, when they're on their 90th person testifying and everybody's saying the same thing, you can either ask people to reserve their comments to things that are new or haven't been covered by another 20 people, or you can ask a question that suggests on this specific issue, how many people are in favor or against, show your hand from the audience. And so you can work your way out of that, but you owe it to the process and the public to always be available and open for them to speak. If they're going to take the time to participate in government, you damn well better let them participate.
Okay, but Frank.
One last one. Yep.
Yeah, but does a participation mean that, can we say you have these other ways, and if you have written testimony, give it to us, and all those things, but do we owe it to everybody who shows up to get a chance to speak for their 3 minutes? And sometimes manipulate the process, you know, where they rally all kinds of people just to make it a 5-hour thing, and then you have to come back the next day and do it again, which can be manipulated.
And it can be, and just as S versions of ordinances can be a way to manipulate changes without the public being able to look at it or comment.
Yeah.
So it comes from both directions, and the assembly just needs to be aware that happens. And, you know, will they fill the room? We had situations where lists were put together, and someone would show up early and put 20 names of their friends that were going to come, and then you know, you'd go through the list and those people wouldn't be there, and then, you know, you'd have to come back. Is there a perfect system? You know, we've got a really good system.
Yep.
It's not perfect, and it never will be. So that's where your judgment comes in. But again, you should always err on the side, unless there is a timing requirement that we lose something, and it was worked into that original ordinance, that if it is a time-sensitive issue, budget or some other law, and we have to respond by a certain date, the assembly can make sure that they do that. And that way, if it can't be delayed, or you can't have another 1 or 2 special meetings, then you can take your action and justify it, but put your findings on the record as to why you did certain things.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dicey. Mr. Weddleton.
Guess maybe a comment on that is, I mean, there is an issue, people can filibuster. You say, we're gonna give everyone a chance to speak, and we don't really, there are times we're just not gaining anything. And I think it was on the taxi one where we did do a Saturday. I think on the taxi ordinance, we were getting a lot of, I don't know that was filibustering so much, but we did a Saturday one, and is that right? And we had it scheduled for hours, just that topic. And a number of people came out, and we were done. But I would worry about filibustering. At some point, we do have to be prepared to use our judgment and say, this is going nowhere, but, you know, running up the clock. But, you know, there's one thing on changes during a meeting. You know, we made changes. We have a public hearing, we hear what people say, then we make a change based on it. And if you say, maybe it's significant, sometimes it is. You say, but now we have to put it through the public process again. But wait a minute, we did it because of the public process. And it's like, well, you get this iterative thing that'll never end. So, you know, you know, we're there to listen and then say, okay, take that knowledge and do something with it. And I don't think we should always have to go back and start over again if we made a change due to public comment.
And I don't think anybody on the task force would argue with that. You know, and it's kind of a weird, subtle difference that the Assembly's got itself into. It's expected that there will be amendments to your actions. And as long as they're not crazy 180-degree reversals or imposing impacts on other parties that are really significant, you know, you go ahead and make those. But it's when, you know, that's part of the process and anticipated. But you need to be able to be cautious and recognize when you're making an amendment or suggesting something that turns it upside down and would bring out a whole nother group of people or another cast of thousands that would be interested. You know, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but it happens every once in a while. But in reality, I can point to maybe less than 10 really difficult, long, drug-out ordinance issues that have been talked about in the 38 years that I've lived in Anchorage doing and participating in this process. So please don't err on the side of, you know, all these things are going to take over and they're going to filibuster or the whole thing and we're going to have a couple of extra meetings. You know, the other people don't like coming to meetings either. So there's just going to be a few times, and if you have one of those a year, that's going to be a pretty special circumstance. So, you know, in the old days, as I like to say, the assembly used to meet every Tuesday night. And for quite a while, they used to meet till up to 5 o'clock in the morning. You know, there wasn't a deadline.
We're not doing that again.
If they got out at 2 or 3, and you know there was a nice bar across the street, then they'd go continue the discussion over there until the bar shut at 5 in the morning, and then you had to take an hour break before the bar opened up again. So, the Planning and Zoning Commission now meets twice a month, maybe. They used to meet every Monday night and sometimes on Saturdays and Thursday nights to be able to get the work done. So I have kind of an old school look that, yeah, your lights are taken up with all the work that you do, and assembly people work hard. You don't get paid more than about 8 cents an hour for the effort that you put in. But that's what the job requires. It takes whatever it takes. But you know, I would be less fearful about a filibustered assembly meeting with 3-minute talkers than I would be with just about anything else. It doesn't happen that often.
Thank you, Mr. Royalton. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just wanted to point out to the members that there's this assembly information memorandum that they provided, and this has the report of the committee that Mr. Potter served on that was chaired by Jane Anbeck, and so that'll get into detail of what discussions and findings the committee came up.
And don't think you're in this on yourself. There's a lot of people, like the people that served before, that, as far as I know, nobody from that task force is broke yet, so we're all still around. We still believe that the process is very important, and if you want us to participate, I'm sure that we'd be willing to do that if you'd like some help. And you guys are busy, and you've got a lot of things on your plate and your agendas every time to take care of. So, and sometimes it's helpful to have almost an arm's length third-party group do some of the background work and then bring some recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Related to this question, Ms. Davidson? Okay. Mr. Costa.
Yeah, I think I tend to reason myself towards Mr. Weddleton's perspective, and reason being the operative term. We are required to provide a reasonable opportunity, and that infinite loop nightmare, I've seen it a few times in the proceedings since I've been around. I've been around since Father Time, but you know. So I think that whatever we do, we just have to be conscientious of both sides of the equation. That any decision made has to take into account public process and the assembly process, and it has to be reasonable on both sides.
And I think that if the assembly asks the question every time you need to do that, you discuss it, provide findings that support your decision, that process in and of itself will result in you considering whether that was a substantive change or not that needs to go back out for open public discussion.
And certainly with Mr. Croft's proposal, the question that is yet to be defined is what does rise to the level of a substantive enough change that an excursion is required, and I that 6 members is the answer, really.
And if not, the public will let you know.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, this follows right up with what Mr. Constant was saying. From your experience of sitting in these meetings and probably hearing the chatter in the audience, I'm still confused of what constitutes an amendment versus an S version. And that might just be me being brand new to this process, but I guess, and maybe just more of a comment, but I'd like to hear your feedback on it. I mean, I don't know if the public's even tracking why we have an S version versus an amendment at a particular time, or why it's become an S version. So I guess I just want to throw that out there.
And I think that's very true. I'm not convinced that all the assembly members understand it either.
I just admitted I don't.
And you did admit it. I think there's more that may not admit it. But S versions are typically where you try and bring forward a completed document so that everybody can see how it fits in context, so that you're looking at the whole picture. And an amendment is typically done on the fly at that night of the hearing, where you would suggest some alternate language, either one word, a comma, or maybe multiple items of non-significant or significant change. And, you know, it's always nice to have the whole document in front of you so you can keep it in context. When the assembly used to meet till midnight every night and would debate and do a lot of amendments at about 11:30 at night, a lot of decisions weren't made very well and things weren't packaged very well. So when you get to that situation where you're having difficulty dealing with amendments and where it's late, where you got other things done, sometimes it is better to back up and say, you know what, how about we put an S version together that fully fleshes out and puts those changes in it so we can examine that language. And sometimes it's substantive, sometimes it's not. It could be the hour of the evening that it's just too much and you've had too much of a night and there's just too much going on. Making sausage and stew is not a good
On that
thing.
subject, I think the phrase is substantial change. It is the amendment you're making, is it a substantial change to the ordinance or not? And so, you know, so you have to come up with, I guess, a definition of substantial change.
And that's gonna be a really hard thing to define.
Yep.
And that's why I'm really suggesting that when it comes to that point and there is a change being made, there be a determination made by the assembly and put your decision and your findings on the record. That will make you think through your own action to determine whether or not it's reasonably substantive or not.
Thank you, Ms. Zolotel. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Gates, do you want to speak on this subject?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add that the phrase substantial change, part of this is in case law. We do have some standards that said, you know, before your when public process requires another public hearing, substantial change is just part of that legal standard. The whole quote from case law is a substantial change that's so significant change the basic character of the legislation. So the basic character is changed to required by law to have any public hearing. Now, does that really help? That's sort of muddy. That's a very subjective type of determination. It really depends on the ordinance that started with and what the change is. For changing the number from 10 to 20, I mean, substantial or not, that's really sort of a judgment call. It depends on what we're talking about. So we can really define the precision exactly when it's substantial change. That changes the basic character of an ordinance. Case by case.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. So I have Ms. Quinn Davidson, Ms. LaFrance, and Mr. Dunbar.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Consistent with what Dean said and what Chris said, I think we have the standard, we have case law, and then we have members who will need to maybe make a decision about whether it's a substantial change. doing this, it's helpful, and, you know, we're considering various changes, so it's good to have all this background. You might have said this at the beginning, and I might have missed it. Can you sort of succinctly describe, this happened, you wrote this memo, you and your team, then 14 happened, and then 17's relationship to that? I think you described it, but I missed it. If you could just kind of do a real brief description.
After AO 37 kind of blew up the system, we were asked by the Rules Committee of the Assembly to form a task force
Right.
that would look at and evaluate not just that occurrence, but other items associated with common problems that were being discussed with the public process.
Right, so
And
that was in 13.
So we did that in 2013. That led to the passage in 2014. And then as a result of some difficult processes that set up and demands on the clerk, there were changes in 2017.
And you all were part of that? Or you got to weigh in?
Not necessarily.
Okay, so are you happy, you were happy with 14, your group, and then not necessarily 17? Or do you have other feedback that you might want to give to us, given what happened in 17?
I've talked to the clerk, but I think Barbara can chime in.
Through the chair, I agree with Mr. Potter as to 14 and the task force report. 17, as you can see, I'm sorry it's not duplex, it was a comprehensive rewrite of the Assembly Rules of Procedure. What 14 did was add a new section called Conduct of Public Hearing. That's what Tim has been telling you, that never existed before. That was a new section of code that was added. In the 17 AO, we reviewed all of the rules of procedure. In that, we did look at the conduct of public hearing, and as Mr. Potter said, it was a little difficult to implement that sign-up sheet. We made a couple of changes. Instead of a shall, it became a may. The clerk may have a sign-up sheet instead of shall. That was the big change, and you can see that in the section on the conduct of the public, the minor changes to that. I guess shalls might be minor, might not. But that's what 17 is.
Thank you. And can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Mr. Chairman? So, Mr. Potter, has your group evaluated this, or did you sort of disband after working through the 2014 list?
We disbanded
Okay.
after the adoption of the 2014. We were asked to come and testify, which we did.
On 2017?
On 2014.
Okay, so you didn't have any involvement or give any feedback to 2017?
Not
except
as
for
a full
to Barbara?
committee.
Okay, well, if you have any feedback, I'd be glad to take it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davidson. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, Ms. Quinn Davidson's questions and the responses address the questions that I have. One follow-up with that, it's clear that a number of the suggestions haven't made it into this, and the one that stood out was the height of the dais. At least I don't believe, Ms. Jones, that has been adjusted.
No, but it is bulletproof now.
That's true.
That's what it is.
And through the chair, I would be interested as well in the committee or task force's review and interpretation of what has been put forward vis-a-vis what you initially put forward. Because there are some really interesting suggestions. Just to comment, Mr. Chair, I like the idea too of the ambassadors at the beginning of the meeting who might help the public find agendas, and I know we talked a little bit about that in other places. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Dunbar.
Oh, thank you. I guess just very briefly, I'm sorry, I was just reading through here. I just wanted to highlight two things. In reading through your task force memo here, it strikes me that the recommendations for substitute version of ordinances we mostly do follow now. It seems like those have been pretty well, asking for a written description of what has changed, providing copies of the S version. And the truth is we don't we amend things after public hearing is closed. We introduce S versions in between, and if we introduce an S version, if we delayed something and introduced an S version, we would reopen public hearing. So that, I think, is all sort of taken care of. I guess I know Pete had said, substantial change leads to an S version, but I think what Mr. Gates said is a little different. It's about changing the basic characteristic of the ordinance. Because we introduce amendments all the time that are substantial changes. The plastic bag ordinance, for example, I think that actually did have some S versions. But when we went from, okay, this micro, what was the term? This thickness to we're just going to ban them outright, that was a substantial change. But I don't think it was an S version. I think it was, we are taking a discrete portion of this ordinance and we are changing it in a substantial way. But it did change the basic characteristic of the ordinance, the basic character of the ordinance. And that to me is what leads to the S version. And I just want to make sure we don't define S versions so broadly that our everyday amendments, even though they're substantial, don't constantly re-trigger the public hearing. Thank you.
And again, in response to that, I totally agree. But I'll reinforce again that it's really important that that discussion occurs at the assembly. That it is either substantial, substantive, or not substantial, or not substantive, and put your findings there and do it. Now, I can't remember the exact time, but it's sometime within the last few months that I've actually heard the chair of the assembly, prior to Felix, indicate that if someone testified on the original version, and instead of coming back on the following time, that they would not be able to speak on the S version. And that is inappropriate. And that is not in keeping.
But I think the code says you can speak to the changes, right?
They should be, the chair should limit them to speak to the changes. But if you're gonna have an S version, you based on what's codified, you should not be able to suggest to them that they, if you speak tonight and you're not gonna wait for the S version to come out, you can't speak on that if you testify tonight. And that's not right.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, so there is another time when we use a substitute version. Not when we're changing the character per se, but also we did it, I think, at the last meeting where the text became so hard to read in real time because it was 3 versions of changes that we needed to consolidate it and have it come back in a way that's legible. And that's one of those areas where it doesn't actually substantively change what we're working on. It just clarifies everything, right? And so I don't know that there's a blanket position where you can just say all S versions are to be scheduled for a new public hearing, because it doesn't change anything. It's literally just getting rid of all of the scrivener's marks and pulling it together into a cogent document.
And in that, as long as you supply your findings, in my opinion, you're good.
Right, and so which also steps me back to the idea of what we're codifying is one thing, and it should be taken very seriously and be very careful, but in parliamentary procedure, custom is also one of the major planks of how a body operates. And so in some ways, we might be wise to have some codified changes and also come up with some schedule of customs that state these are the ways we do our business that are less formal, because we need to be allowed the flexibility to manage our business. And so I just would ask us to contemplate the ways the rules of order have developed over time, that there are more ways than just the law, right? And Robert's rules. There are finer tools that we can use as well.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Quinn Davidson on this.
Oh, I was just going to say, Mr. Constant, that example that you're bringing up, I think that we ditched the S versions entirely and went with a new ordinance so that it was cleaner.
You're right, and so that actually, interestingly, sets us back up for a new public hearing, right? And so therein lies one of those moments of decision-making where we could have a conversation, could be found in one way or another. But you're right, we did in that case, instead of coming back with an S version, no rush, let's just move this forward. So interesting area of our work.
It almost gives you 2 times to testify on a similar.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Weddleton.
Couple points. One on the having lowering the dais. I think a quicker, cheaper alternative is just elect shorter people. So I did my part.
Could put a couple of steps, up, at the podium.
I haven't come. I sit on a step. So,
But it is intimidating, and if none of you have ever testified from at the podium, you should do it.
many times, and it is even after being on this side, it's still somewhat intimidating. So, but I think you mentioned, or someone mentioned an example, or Forrest did on the the bag ban. Is we had one amendment that transformed that whole issue, and we learned that we should have rewritten it, put it out to a new public hearing, because we found on media a lot of retailers thought, oh, they're only going to do the 2 bags, I'm okay. But we heard right away, whoa, this is totally different. And we eventually had to come back and had a huge another process that was uncomfortable. It was unfortunate for everyone. I think we dealt with that twice after. And it's something like that. When we transformed something there, we should have put the brakes on it. There's no rush on it. And said, okay, this is substantial. Rewrite it, put it out for new public hearing. I think we would have saved ourselves a lot of trouble.
Well, I guess just a anecdote is that, sometimes in the consulting business or construction business or whatever, there's always a rush to try and get it done. And so there's never enough time to get it done right, but there's always enough time to redo it. And sometimes it's much more efficient to intervene on your own behalf and say, you know what, let's just get this change all consolidated and bring it back at the next meeting and do it that way, rather than having it all opened up all over again. I run into that problem in consulting all the time.
You want to speak on this subject?
Just very briefly. Sure. I agree with that to a certain point, but I also don't want to get to a place, I don't think anyone's suggesting it, but where every time we do an amendment, practically speaking, we do this again and again and again. And because there is a place for on-the-floor amendments and then passing the thing. We have a finite amount of time, we have a lot of things before us, and sometimes we have to just devote to pass things. So.
And I think Chris's comment about part of it's based on how you've conducted your business forever. It's anticipated that you're going to put forward amendments and get that done that evening. And that's not unusual or unanticipated at all. Again, it's just making sure that the public knows why you've made the decision that you've done. It's simple as that.
Thank you, Mr. Douglas. Thank you, Mr. Whittleton. Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a comment for Mr. Potter and a question for the clerk. If you do go back and reevaluate the 2017, I would ask that the committee consider issues of equity and inclusion, just kind of as an overarching for making Assembly more welcoming. I know it's been one of my personal tasks to try to get more families. We have now 3 members with school-age children on the body, and so really I made a quiet basket. But some of those types of things, so I would really love that feedback, particularly where we don't see representative folks at our meetings. And the question I have for Barbara is, when we do an amendment that we manage to get out ahead of time, and we're not doing it on the fly, are those available to the public as part of the documents, or is it just popping up on the screen? What are the mechanics of that?
They are not available ahead of time. We've had some discussions about it, but I think some of you know we're just keeping up with what we've got. We're, like, you can see this task force report, like Suzanne mentioned, there's tons of things in it, like having displays and information, and we just don't have the ability to do that. So the floor amendments, we've had discussions about how to publish the floor amendments, and we don't have a consistent way to do that with every floor amendment. I will tell you, one meeting in the last couple of months, there were 16. And so that would be some concern for us. It's confusing to lay 16 on the table, but it would be difficult or confusing to get 16 on the website. So there's always copies available at the meeting, but sometimes they're made during the meeting, and sometimes those we have a copier there and get them as soon as possible. Now, for some of your big ones, toxic chemicals, plastic bags, you're working on those? Yeah, we've got the ordinance, the S, and sometimes the floor amendments on the website. When you give us that time, and it's important, and you're talking about 1 or 2 a year, yes, we can get those up. Not all of them.
Thank you. Can I just mention something related to that?
Sure.
Quickly? And sometimes people don't introduce their amendments, which is another thing that could confuse the public if we put it out there, but then it's never discussed. Pros and cons. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Salzo. Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. So 3 more comments before we have to move on. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, but a dozen things that come up, and we need some time. I need some time to digest all this. We've got to make some tough decisions. Key word here in terms of how we relate to the public that Tim brought up, and that's word fairness. People need a little trust that the system is fair and it isn't tipped in one way or another. And those are subjective, but that's our job. And if somebody help me think about here. I think our work sessions and our committee meetings were required to have a public input at the end of it.
Not work sessions.
If there's time available.
So committee meetings, yes. Work sessions, there is no requirement. As Mr. Potter said, sometimes if there's time available, we will.
Committee meetings, there is.
Yes.
Required. All right, so, yeah, Pete and I are used to an environment where the committees do very substantive work and they come out with a definitive action. This is the bill that's going forward on this. And lots of time for public input, both telephonically and so on and so forth. So we don't do that. So then all of that public input, the only opportunity largely is for people at the formal assembly meeting. So we have overloaded or localized the one time that the public gets there, and that contributes to it. We might want to think about stepping back on that, for substantive changes in ordinances of what the committee does, as opposed to having that all happen at the Tuesday night meetings. Just the only other thing, as Tim has pointed out, we need our chair to have the courage and the backup to make some decisions on all these emotionally charged issues. And I assume in our system, if you rule that we don't need more input from the stakeholders or whatever because the amendment was not substantive material, didn't change the character, we need that any one of us can challenge a ruling. And then it's the rule of 6, is it not? Yeah, and so on and so forth. But by and large, my predisposition is going to back up the chair when in doubt. It'll only be substantive when I'll say, I think you're all wet, Mr. Chair. I challenge your reading. This is important stuff, and we really demands our attention. The people need to be able to trust that the process is fair and not being tipped. Excuse me, preaching.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Gates, did you want to add something quickly? Oh, okay. Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. And I think that the public is never wary to tell us when we're doing something that they A, don't agree with, or B, have an opinion on. And we hear it by volumes of email, by phone calls, by showing up to the committee meetings or showing up to the public meetings. And so while it might feel like we totally end the conversation with packing everyone in, I have no doubt the public hears when we're working on things that are important to them, and they get it to us. And to the clerk, just to your credit, we're now, since I've been on the body, gone from having the amendments just kind of ethereal and maybe showing up on the table to having them up on the wall, projected, and now to being amended on the fly in the moment in red. And so we are making good progress towards the process of helping people understand, and it's measurable by just the change we've had in the last year. And finally, just one note that I would point to, that this hasn't changed, and we are doing something that is against our own rules, and that's page 16. It appears that the line 27, section
The 2017 amendments.
yeah, that a person may testify on any topic during audience participation, not just on items not on the agenda. And so this is an issue that we've colloquially been holding to an old standard, and probably, according to our rules, need to update our thinking or our practice. So.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Did you have something to add on that, Fred? Sure, go ahead.
Please don't make the same mistake that your previous chair made on the resolution that was coming forward in the 4th Avenue Theater that I protested. When the chair said, you really don't have to worry about this because it's just a resolution. It really isn't binding or have any legal teeth. If it's not worth doing, then why the hell are you doing it? Pardon my language, but that was the end all for me that evening when that statement was made. If it's not important to do, then why are you doing it? Or if you're telling me, now we're going to take this action, but don't worry about it, it doesn't mean it. Everything you do does mean something and should mean something. And that's it.
I think that Mr. Rivera, though, the takeaway from that night was very different for me, and that is, when that item came up, and we made concessions to a member of the public to come up and speak, and we, by the ruling of the chair, we're going to stop the representative of the people who are actually subject to a resolution from speaking, and that was super shocking to me. If we would let someone who's an interested third party and yet not the first-hand party speak. And so what that comes back to is how we implement our customary practices is we have to be very careful with that. And if we're going to let someone speak, we have to be conscientious to let the other parties be heard. Because that to me was the gravest mistake. His comment about it's not as so important to me, that blew past me as soon as I saw we let one side speak but not the other.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. So I need to wrap this up. So Mr. Whittleton?
Not good, thanks.
All right, thank you. So this work session is over.